Kate Chopping, The Awakening, Block 2. Unit 1, Locating the Awakening, Background and Context. Unit 2, Contextualizing the Awakening. Number 3, Critical Response of the Awakening. Unit 4, Critical Approach to the Awakening, Feminist, Psychologist or other. Suggest reading and reference. Block introduction. The Awakening by Kate Chopin is novel published in 1899 at the very end of the 19th century and is Chopin's second and final novel. Even though this novel was published the highest of the popularity, this work literally marked the end of the career. The Awakening through now consider the classic as well as see in the unit 3 and 4 may not be recite the time of the publication. This could have been because the novel deals with a theme that was not acceptable to the Victorian reader. The Victorian age between 1822 to 1914, as you may be aware, corresponded more or less of the years Queen Victoria regent. Since the novel deals with a human woman who changed uh, drastically from a married woman and a mother become independent as well as sexually aware self individual woman. As a reader of the time probably could not come to terms with the themes of the novel and hence did not accept it. Needless to say, this novel never got due them. Unit 1, we try and locate situation the novel Awakening by providing the intellectual setting to the novel and also brief looking the socio-cultural space of the age. We also introduce you to the right Kate Chopin and her works place the awakening with the overview and we look at the what biographical approaches to the literature is and see if it helps us understand the novel better. Unit 1, Locating the Awakening, Background and Context. Objective Introduction, the intellectual setting of the Awakening, the 19th century social cultural background, 19th century Britain. Location, the writer and the novel, symbolics in the Awakening. In this unit, we will be introduced to the writer Kate Chopin and examine the time during which she lived and wrote. The Awakening, it is important that we learn about the writer and her time to get better understand the Chopin. The Awakening and her other writings, we will also to take a look at the social and cultural millennium in which the novel is located and the philosophical idea of the 19th century. The privilege then so that you comprehended the themes of the novel better. Introduction. We will now looking at the discuss the social cultural background and intellectual philosophical idea of the late 19th century as those are contested with which is the novel. The Awakening is set in Kate Chopin will read the intelligent observe with a keen irony and observe the mood of the end of the century. She was familiar with the work of Gustave Flaubert, French novelist who wrote Madame Bovary. The Chopin's novel has been compared with Flaubert through the review that will be discussed Unit 3. Tolstoy, Russian novelist who wrote Anna Karenina, to which also some critics have compared the Awakening. Guy de Maupassant, French writer who she greatly admired. In fact, she was inspired by the story, many of which dealt with the dark themes of suicide, infidelity, drawing, etc. And she transferred 8 themes of them, managed to sell on the 3 most conventional. It must also mention the some of same theme are also present in the work of her. She had also read the work of other modern European writers such as Ibsen, Swinburne, influence of American writers, Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scattered Letter, Herman Melville's Moby Dicks have been traced in her work. Henry James is a psychological novel for intense portrayal of a lady was contemporaneous the Chopin's time. The dark vision of the human condition noted by German philosopher Arthur Schoffer's 1788 and 1860, influenced by Chopin, as did the music of the Richard Wagner. 1813 to 83, a German composer of the opera. The next section will examine the social culture background context of the 19th century as well as it was during the period that novel was writing. The intellectual setting of the awakening. The decade in which the awakening was published, namely in 1890s, was a complex time and is mirrored the under-resolved tension between the old world and the new. The transition time between the two centuries, the traditional vice versa, modern was a thinking, intellectual thought was time, began referred by the influence work of Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, Aldous Huxley, and the end of the century by Simon Ford. Theories of evolution that determined were inspired the naturalistic way of thinking, the way in which women are locked in the social roles for which there was no escape except through the death. On one hand, there was a faith in ways of destiny and preordinate kind of living, and there was science and comfort shopping in her belief of the relativity of morals. Fixed truth in form moral of religious or scientific shadam Chopin's ironic glaze. The story of few strong women living at the time have been documented by historian, women who demonstrated independence in personal life, and those who campaigned for women's voting rights in the public realm. New terms of ideal marriage were describing as follow. Let your department of mutual your independence, equal your obligations, reciprocal. Elizabeth Cady Station published her article, The Women Bible 1895, and Charlotte Parkins Gilman, a member of National American Women Suffragette Association, published Women and Economics 1898. Gilman argued the case of women's economic independence as the foundation for better marriage, equal relationship, and more humanity of women. Marriage is not a perfect unless between class equal. There is no equality between those who do their share in the world work in large, newest, and highest way, and those who do not their in the smallest or lowest way. However, although there was some actual women in the last year of the 19th century who were redefined the meaning of freedom and equality. Most of the representation of single of diverse women, the new women or the widow offer only traditional and weak solution, hardly being able to free themselves from the pattern of the marriage and family. Josie Dere stated the following: female passion was thought to be immoral and unhealthy by evening some of the most aggressive proponents of realism and feminism in the last decades of the 19th century. To suggest otherwise was enter the extremely perilous water. The water is in Edward Ponichella and the protagonist of the Awakening Swings. Considered female characters separated from the men by the unmarried status. Their delusionment with the husband or divorce seldom consider the avenue of liberated sexual behavior and option. Even Gilman mentioned in the last paragraph, Spot caught strong against female eroticism, sex in her view useful for reproduction only. She argued for the sanctity of marriage, monologue, and fidelity, claiming that the worst of all were promiscuous and temporary sex relations. Thus, we need to understand that Chopin is writing against such socio-cultural background, where her Edna Ponteller is one of the first women to think and to express herself and act with deficient manners in which she does. Chopin's daughter Mandelet who shows instead that Edna's sexual psychological is progresses in his ideas in therapy. Is also advised for her time as a physician instead on the values of domesticity as a cure of women nervous and depressive condition. The next section will look the location of author writer Kate Chopin and her work novel and awakening. Critics had to compare Kate Chopin to other American realists and the natural writers who were the contemporaries such as Franklin Norris, Stephen Carney, Theodore, Henry James, and Edna Pottenler to their heroines, all rather sexless compare of Edna and the description of sexual matters in general are obtained. Not only did Chopin draw a heroine who was not afraid to be sexually begun, she is honest and bold enough to articulate the extramarital sex, next not to the accompanied by guilt, and that women was perfectly justified in seeking selfhood and fulfillment outside instruction of marriage and motherhood. In addition, it is also clearly stated Edna believed herself to be becoming more of a spiritual being as she continued on her journey of awakening, descending alongside in the social scale. Both role model of womanhood, Adlai Ratingole and Matt Monisis raise the present as alternative ways of being, rejected by Edna Potler as they are inappropriate of her. Adlai, his mother woman, her Adlai substance of her children with her husband to the sense of identification is so completely so affected straight kind of margin of slaves. Mally Reese is a solitary artist detached so completely from the real world that she appeared to others as arrogant or insane. Edna is a solitary soul too, and that was the original title of the novel. Those moments is novel, many when she rejoined the salute with relish and amen. When she take a pleasure in feeling her round arms, eating and hearty meals, seeking the material object in her house, all thought for first time when she is by herself. But her art does not sustain her completely. She needs her fantasy and delicious. When she is swimming out in the sea alone from the first day, feeling a sense of her new power, and of course, in the last sense, when she is truly solitary without even the burden of piece of cloth, only hum of the bees and fragment of pinks to keep her company. She is also the hopeless romantic for warmth, the vision of idea. World cannot be substituted by Derlery's son. She is existent too. Her vision of life, dark and somber, present as followed. There were days, and when they appeared to her like to grotesque pandemonium, and humanity like worms struggling blind towards the invisible uh, annihilation. The fact the Chopin novel had the courage to employ such modest theme through language and style that was both explicit and deeply symbolic makings the awakening far ahead of other literary writing published in the late 19th century. The time were not prepared to receive it, and thus it had to wait for another 70th century before it could climb its rightful place in the literary canon. Before we got to any further, we might need to look at the socio-cultural background. context of the 19th century as well as the during the period that the novel was written. This was short to the next section. The 19th century, a social cultural background. All thought The Awakening is an American novel. Some information about that general background of 19th century social cultural context, relationship, and more specific literary content may help you see it and understand it better. Hence, some facts related to Victorian England and fiction writers in the 19th century by Britain were such as George Eliot, Charles Dickens, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Austen, William Makepeace, etc., whom you may have read about, may be useful to you or given is the reason. 19th century Britain. This was a time of great transition from the agriculture to the industry. A discarding of old traditional religious faith in favor of accepting medical natural process. A new sense of empowerment of women and the working class, natural working class, writing a fiction became new form of commerce. Readership become far more dispersed. Women according for major share both as a consumer and product of fiction. Many novels were serialized in magazines and periodical. Power of fiction, periodicals, and a reader often played an important role of deciding what the writer would write, thereby determine the text. Lending the circulating libraries much room to satisfy growing demands as regards subject matter, social command, and moral guidance were important aspects. Thematically, domestic middle class setting, an issue related to family such as marriage and morality, relationship were widely dealt with, but sex was taboo. The fallen women had to be punished, removed for society, so the moral fabric was not compressed. However, by the last year of century, there also began emerge a picture of new women and novel engaging feminist questions as the employee of women. Still, sex relationship that would challenge established moral code were hardly discussed. Thus, Kate Chopin's awakening would have been considered to transgressive and expect to accept. We shall look at the intellectual setting of the awakening next. Location, the writer, and the novel. We will discuss the novel at the length later, but just to give you examples of how to locate of the writer and the setting of the novel has been bearing on the novel. We will be looking at some examples from the novel in this section. Another crucial aspect of location of writer, and here novel is a setting within which the actions of take place. It began Great Islay, an island 50 miles south of North Orleans and Celio summer resort, and goes to later be situated in the city of New Orleans. The city was America, Southern and Corle. The Corles were the descent of the French and Spanish colonies of 18th century. They were Catholics and believed in strong and conserving family value, spoke French and felt close sense in community to their own cultural group. They formed appropriate one-third of population of New Orleans 1860. Thus somewhat separate in identify the analog American society. Their attitude towards life was easygoing and they liked to live a life rich in sensual pleasure and enjoyment. Even so, Louisiana remains a very conservative state. The practical family being the foundation of society, and even with the choral woman appeared to be frank, open, the sensual like Adlai in the novel. They were in reality unquestionable caste, religion, and completely committed to their families. In fact, this is what makes their open manner possible, and we get a sense of this contradiction reflection in the character of Edley, who is openly flirts with the robot and is at the same time the true embodiment of ideal devoted wife and mother. Edina is herself not for such a background. The other, she is uh, married to a Corley, and her start of the novel seems to be thrown into the atmosphere to which she is stranger. We hope you done at least one reader of the novel by now. If you remember when Adelaide noticed Edna awakening, the presence of Robert, she warned him, asking him to keep away from her. State clearly, she is not one of us. She may make a blunder of taking about serious. Edna is described by Kentucky Presbyterian by birth, and he too reserved a rigid, averring clashes with open censorship. She finds her not only she awake to subsequent proper by infatuations of Robert to become untaking drafting things who was another to resent her. She is also attracted to Adlai and Melerices in the straight seductive scenario where is investing she also play a part. New Orleans was also America, Calvinistic and puritanical, and when Edna returned to the city at the end of her summer philadelphia, newly awake to the selfhood and sexual consequence, she has to scump once more the conservation of her social role, receiving guests even Tuesday, and supervising her husband meals among other boring domestic chores. She does not wish to do any of this now, and thus she simply does it. Robert has does the honorable things by escaping Mexico. He has to traditional to serious imagination of relationship with the married woman. Even towards the end of the novel, when he returns, confesses has he been imaginary making her his wife, despite his best judgment, he cannot visualize the kind of free relationship based Edna ideals of liberty and self-definition of she suggested when she says, I give myself the right choose. Thus for second time, the novel he run away leaves behind and not says goodbye because I love you. Clearly indicate a clash of culture. But that is something we shall examine in the next section when she discusses the symbolism in the novel. Symbolism in the awakening. In the section we shall define symbolism and look in terms of symbolism in the awakening. Symbolism, according to Rose Marfin and Supriya M. Ray, in the Bedford Glory of Critical and Literary Terms, comes from the Greek symbolic meaning to throw together the serious and relatively sustained use of symbols to represent such as other things or idea. They also suggest that along with the writers explicit use of particular symbol in a literary work. The term symbolism something refers to presence in work or body of work or suggestive association give rise to incriminate implication meaning. The French symbolism believes that writers create use subjective or private symbol in order to convey very personal and intense emotional to experience the reaction. They were for option that the network of such symbol from the core of any literary work. With the definition to guide us, we shall now to take look at the imagery of the sea and the symbolism next. The clash of culture mentioned in the early session is also represented through the imagery of the sea that form the backdrop of Grand Isle. Sensory enveloping enveloping Edna in the warm embrace while his background in her own contamination of soleil and the harsh weaker reality. That is her posh home in Esplanade Street in New Orleans, where she is complete to live on her husband Bonte, and thus remains of his possessions. Caught between these oppositional forces, she lost herself, unable to adjust a longer to her role of wife and mother, not encouraged with the solar along with the artist. Like mild resist can, waiting for robot who she thinking can set her free and falling into arm of the Alice. Robin, reader the symbols of trip of uh, Chaminda. She is almost mysterious, idyllic setting where finding the atmosphere of the church. Suffocated, Edna was a leave and goes in a deep sleep in maddening Antonis. When she wakes up, there was a fantasy of telling stories in which Edna and Robert wake up like lovers in a believer world. There is also view of the lovers always present through nameless and faceless, symbolic in the way they are lost each other to but lost alone to refer the world. And the women in back always preoccupied with the beads of rosary. Having hinted at the symbols in the novel, we might also need to take a look at some of Kate Chopin's other works, largely from the point of view of her overpowering contrast to the awakening. And that we shall to presently next section. Kate Chopin overview. It needs to be mentioned that Kate Chopin was often be compared to other American realistic and naturalist writers who were compared such as Frank Norris, Stephen Caron, Thoreau Darcy, and Henry James. Chopin wrote about life, the criticisms and people she was familiar with. She enjoyed instant success their writing. She also dealt with the French Corliss and Cajun. She had made the observation during her time in New Orleans and Court Valley. The Conjuns, also known as Acadian, were descendants of the French colonies who were settled in Louisiana and thought were the observed the describing of Corliss. The Conjuns and Corliss are often portrayed as separation identified today. Here, short stories and essay examine these such as love, independence, passion, her freedom. Chopin attend confidence and give the speeches and was well known the received most of the time during the extremely short writing career. Some information of Kate Chopin other work will be useful background will help you the place. The awakening with the contest was the she were before and it and after. She began write the publication on 1890. Kate Chopin as well as the reader of Louisiana for her. What was the term? Local color stories by Beard Flock and Night in the Arcade. Her first novel, At Fault, is also is most of the Louisiana. Her collection of short stories, A Vacation in and a Voice, what was the published after the awakening, was rejected in publisher. Thought it is not a certain if the happening as a result of negative response received by the novel. The awakening was in a independent decision on the part of publisher. She did not send one of her stories. The Strom, the publication considered it to be too sexually explicit. The Kate Chopin is most popular short stories were The Story of Horror, The Strom, Desire of Baby, A Praise is Silk Shocky, and Respectable Woman. Her other popular work was in children's stories. It was must remember that during the time The Awakening was published, 1899, the feminist novelist was just started to be talking about America. Louisiana began. Southern states were quite conservative. The new fad of the feminists had not reached there yet. In fact, during that time, under the Louisiana laws, a woman was said to be properly of husband. Needless to say, the awakening would not have been received well such as environment. The awakening discussed quite openly the emotions, sexual needs of women, and this had two taboo topic among the Southerners. Chopin herself was, and this would have taboo topic among the Southerners. Chopin herself was quite surprised and upset about the reception her novel received, and she published only 3 more short stories for her death. Kate Chopin died for brain hemorrhage in 1904, not 4. Posthumously, Chopin were remembered as a writer of local color, as her work displayed the peoples of New Orleans. Remember the regional novel discussing in the Unit 2 and Block 1. She was recognized a great writer till the awakening was discovered per Schelde, Norway literary scholar, much later, 15 years later, in 1960s. However, from we were standing today in history, we realize the novel is an honest, open matter of fact, declare of female sexuality and women's emotion and sexual needs, and it were realistic written. The awakening has now made a place for itself, but we need to remember that this observation and our acceptance of novel are the retrospect. Let us sum up. In this unit, we have discussed the philosophy ideas that were part of the atmosphere of the time during which Kate Chopin wrote. These contents are important as such content provide the background of literary text. The awakening. In our case, the unit has to examine the various flaws upon Chopin that helping the shape our novel. The attention have been made local, the novel within the American literary trade, while tracing connection with some other well known as text drawing, significant parallel to tell you little about Victorian background and 19th century Britain. Writing so you can to read to novel against the literary tradition, analyzing the settings of the sea since the Gulf water makes a critical contribution to the text, both setting as well as symbol, as given some basic information about Kate Chopin's other writers as well. Contextualizing the awakening. Important. Consider the awakening, biographical approach of awakening, Kate Chopin, early life and background, the choral background, the history of the Orland, Edna Polster and Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin, Edna Poltner. The updating of this unit had helped you. Understanding what the biographical appraisal of literature is. Now some important fact of Kate Chopin life. So you can see for yourself there are any similar between them and what you find in the novel. Read The Awakening with the help of the biographical approach. Discuss the main theme of while women awake to sexual consequence of desire, her need for personal anatomy, and her right to be an individual and not only roles such as that wife or a mother is obstacle that may come in the way during such a journey in the light of the biographical approach. Introduction. In this unit, we will introduce the novel, so the important themes can be presented to you. This will help you discuss, analysis them. You will also be introduced by the main character, Edna Potler, her husband, Lance Potler, Robert Lorbian, Alice Arbin, Adlai Lattingone and her husband, Madame Olse Pressy, and some less important characters like Victor Labrador and Marquetta. Contextual. The Awakening. The Awakening by Kate Chopin is a story of Edna Pondler, a 28 years old Harlem woman like New Orleans. It is about her awakening to the sexual consciousness, her discover and assertion of this new self through rebellion against the conventional role of being wife as a mother and the The novel is about self-expression and women's right to be the herself and to be the individual. Edna is looking a typical married of Lance Portner, a marriage of convinced made when she was very young, not made with love or romance. Though he is a good man and caring husband, her romantic urgency, the physical longing have at this stage hardly been articulate and sincerely not satisfied. The family goes to Grand Islay for summer, where she meets the spend a lot of time with Robert LeBaron, an attached young bachelor, talking, swimming, beyond together. And of course, the Corley husband is never jealousy. But you will find out more about this in the section of Corley background. Before they know it, both Edna and Robert being to feel an attraction towards each other and in intensity of emotion they precise and as a unusual, unmanageable and somewhat threatening in the context of their life and convey reality. This emotion is passionate in all consuming, leaving on no rooms for thought sensible actions. Robert realized the impossibility of the situation and not knowing how to deal with the fields execute to make money. We will discuss if he is a escapist, a coward of honorable man, or all of above. Once he gone, the truth conveys Edna with further snakeness and clarity. The summer, just like the flirtation, he come to an end of Edna and her family return to their posh home on Espalien Street in the city. But things can never be the same for Edna as she is changed person. As a result of encounter with Robert and her new self. This is new Edna is a painter. She does not care about her wifely responsibility or about keeping up appearance or observation to the customs. This new Edna refused to stay home on Tuesday to receive her caller as her husband expects her to, but goes out just because she prefers to do so. Her husband complains about her lack of supervision of the servants and he leaves in the middle of the badly cooked dinner to go out the club to eat. She became careless and distressed with the regarding to domestic affair, letting everything on the home front slide as it is no longer of any significance to her. Her family by now is meaningless and distant for her. Her desire of free sea process her identity and be her own person belongs now her primary focus. She wants to feel a sense of being financially independent unanswerable to anybody for her action. In other words, completely anonymous. She refuses to go for sister's wedding and has no thoughts about property or what the world will say with regard to any of their actions. Mr. Podler worries about the wife's health and her strange behavior, consulting a doctor about both. Although she appeared to be robust health, a disconnect has happened when given the appearance that she is not quite all there. Mr. Potler leaves town according to of business for long period, and she refuses to accompany with him. His grandmother take his children away and she, Edna Potler, stay back alone in the house, perfectly happy to paint and do her own things. During this time, she also regulated visit Mademoiselle Risley and the paint of expectation talent, but also strange character and few people like and who occurs she had met during the summer at Gyan Isley. Robert Libert writes on a regular basis of Mimrasi seeking information about Etna. Letters that she shared with Etna. The letter suggests that he is in love with her. Sometimes Mimrasi betrays too. Mim praises music evoke in Etna. The nostalgical time spent with Robert, while it also makes Etna remains in the state. Or perpetual anticipation, a physical longing. She is alone and in the right frame of the mind, the body of foreman of the world is secured such as Alice Orbin to come along and make her the prey. She is still very much in love with Robert, but he is not there, and her sexual consequence has been awaked. Besides, she hardly cared about her action because her frustration and not being able to possess Robert. All this while Edna and Alice Orbin became more and more physically intimate with each other. As he visits her regularly as she lives alone in the pigeon house. This is much similar house that she has moved into round and corner of his husband's post. Expensive, much bigger house in Espelin Street. Her reason for moving, which she planned to implement during her husband's absence, are to have a place of her own and she can feel she can independently deal with it financially so she can be individual in her own right rather than being only Losian pointless wife. Besides, she hardly cared about the attraction because the frustration belonged to able of life. Of course, her husband disapproved, most bothered as he is about what people will say. He says face to kicking up appropriate by immediately putting up the big house of major repair of renovation, thereby justify Edna move and try to prevent the gossip mill from the running. Before she moved into the pigeon house, she threw a party for a small selected group of friends. This is an important event in the novel and we will discuss some details later. Somewhere instead of Edna Ponce keep the waiting for Robert Luberon, and then one day as she waiting for me resides in her home, he come and they meet. She disappointed and heart broken. The such accident meeting should have occurred between them instead of one where Robert should seek her out intentionally as soon as her arrives in town. He walks her home, and during the quiet evening spent together, she forced him to articulate a real feeling towards her. Both express their emotion, albeit is sad, resigned the nostalgic way. He tried his best to stay away from her, from temptation, stating clearly enough that being a married woman she was not free to belong him. However, as soon as they confess their love for each other, Edna is called away, but her friend Adlai Ratingos to assist her during the childbirth. She implores him to wait for her return, but when she does return, Robert is gone, having left her, not saying goodbye because I love you. Both at late childbirth and the not a tormenting experience of Etna as the writers with a full clarity. To Edna that she can hardly live in the world by thus of her own desire and confession alone. The decision of being a mother has a determined has a action after disappointment night spending in deep through the reflection. She go back to Grand Islet the next morning and locating of her first awakening and walk away into the waves of the sea. Naked and alone in search of her final home. Having presented out the line of the novel, we hope you are reading short novel by now. Let us quick examine the biographical approach of literature before we move further in our exploration of text and novel genre. Biographical approach to the awakening. What is the biographical approach of reading novel? The biographical approach of reading novel is when we read about writers on life in order to know his or her personal story so that we get some clues and intents to understand the novel better. Just as it is important to know about the society, culture and political of the time when the novel was written and published, it helped to know the female society and political time and when the novel written and published her know the family's background view of beliefs of the writer. It would be interesting to know the Chopin's real life was like. Was she independent and can we draw partial between Edna Polder and her right? What was Chopin marriage like? The themes that American deals with the contemporary feminist and were hardest addressed in her time by other writers. What is her own life give the experience and ability to discuss them to so free and successfully. The answer to some of the question is what biological criticism is about. The information will help us make better scene of the event then take a place in the text. The next section we shall take a look at the early life of background of Kate of Fenhert on Kate Chopin as she was later known as. Kate Chopin early life and background. Kate Chopin, early life and background. Kate O'Flaherty Flaherty was born in San Lucia in 1850, and she was one of the five children, but she was only one of her survived beyond the age of 25. Chopin attended Catholic board schooling, and a couple of months later, when she was just 5, her father died in a tragic train accident. She came back home after the father's death and lived at home surrounded by only women, all single and freely independent, all widows, her mother, grandmother, and great grandmother. When she was 7, she went back to the Sacred Heart Academy, where she was taught French and music and was distinguished study student winning medals and awards. Whether at home or the Sacred Heart Academy boarding school with the nuns, Chopin grew up in the midst of intelligence and independent woman since there was no male around her home or in school. During the early years, she never did witness trading female submission and male dominant roles. He had father not passed away so strictly, or had she had great grandfather or grandfather around. She might have witnessed a traditional final setup where the male was in a patriarch in the family. Hence, she did not have any knowledge of understand of such marriage and relationship of male dominance and female submissions that defined 19th century marriage. Actually, most marriage even today follow this traditional pattern. After gradually from the Sacred Heart Academy, Chopin became a part of St. Lucia's social sense, but in needs of be noted that even her youth she was clinical, writing her diary. I dance with people I despise, amuse myself with men, those only talented is in their feet. She was desperate to spend more time with my dear reading and writing, and I love you well. In 1870, she married Oscar Chopin, the right man, and the son of prominent Corley family from Louisiana. They share similar values and tastes. I had a special kinship of the kind that Edna in the novel does not find there her husband. The portion of the Edna Louis Portler marriage, according to Chopin's biography, Emily thought, has similar with that of her parents, who too shared the common interest to uh, spontaneous warmth. During their European honeymoon, Kate Chopin was emancipated woman, drinking, smoking, publicly, walking alone. Both she was in husband's keeping church. During her New Orleans years, 1870-1870, she took a long walk and streetcar ride alone, exploring the city and enjoy her own company. Notice what Edna say, the clap the disease, it always feels sorry of women who don't like to walk. They miss so many rare glimpses of life, and we women learn so little of life on the road. Kate Chopin was also conceived pregnant and therefore not be seen in a public, forced to stay indoors except for grand essay vacation. Kate became a talented mimic, keen observer, and even for social critics. Daniel S. Ricken, Kate Chopin and her choral stories, Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania Press. Kate Chopin had 6 children with Oscar Chopin during the first 10 years of her marriage. She mentioned about enjoy a wide range of freedom that was unconventional for her time. She was a good wife and a mother, but when domesticity became overwhelming, she would escape quiet to smoke to walk around alone through New Orleans. She had very strong and independent options about most contemporary issues and conventional issues of the day. Oscar Chopin loved her dearly and admired her intelligence, opinion, and her strength. However, misfortune struck them and the cottage Brokenfield 1879, after which the Chopin family moved to Coltiverla, Louisiana, where he owned property. Kate Chopin managed to adjust to this small provincial town but was also a source of gossip with an eccentric way. Her husband died suddenly in 1882 in swamp fever and thought devastated. Chopin ran his store in plantation for years. She was also thought to have encouraged the affection of management. Albert Sapte, who pursued her, but by 1884 he had returned of San Lucia lived with her mother. Edna too goes to Adelaide, the mother woman, leaving Robert. When Chopin's mother died, following a year, and she has to be slight responsibility for her upbearing the six children. She turned to write in 1889, a creative activity, the help of grow and write around often a strong view on women, marriage and sex. Her first published story, Wiser Than a God, 1889, is about a woman who became a great artistic success, but only after mother's death. Kate Chopin was immediately success as a writer, had connecting with the writer, journalist, and literary figure. She was invited to get a reader to Wednesday Club, the most prestigious intellectual women club in San Luis. Her second and final novel, The Awakening, was published in 1899. She reminded through her life unconventional and emancipate, cherishing her freedom and her solitude. Obvious from the decision not to marry after but devote her life to what she loved best for writing. Like Edna, she was the regular woman and the one who ruled, who look on, who stands alone. Having discussed with the life of Kate Chopin briefly, let us look the Corley background of the novel next. The Corley the background. The section of the 19th century Louis Corley culture and the people is important because it helps us to understand the setting and social culture of Chopin users of the awakening better. The Paris of Louisiana Series New Orleans, Danish S. Raskin, Kate Chopin and her college stories, Filipina University in Philadelphia Press. The city of New Orleans and two distinct parts on America, on French, Corliss, and described as those descent of European ancestors, French and Spanish, and Lucia thought descent from the French were many more. So the Sir Creole in Louisiana would consider himself herself to be basic of the French descent. The picture of the artistic, exotic life of social gathering, musical stories of final during pain in the novel is clearly drawn from the life led by Collins in the New Orleans in the 19th century. The Chopin was very much a part of in the novel. The difference between American Edna from the religious Kentucky background and the life of Corley Resort on Grand Isle comes through very clearly. The Corla are much more vast, free, open, and fermentous, and she finds the atmosphere very strange. Let us now examine the similar of other ways between Edna Pohl, their protagonists of the novel, The Awakening, and Kate Chopin, the author. The history of New Orleans. New Orleans, as I may be aware, in the state of Louisiana in the United States of America. It is on a Gulf of Mexico with the state of Mississippi to the east, Texas on the west, and Arkansas to the north. New Orleans has very interesting history as it was basically colonized by both French and Spanish at various point of time. In order to get a better understanding of the history of New Orleans and the Corley culture, it would be present to look at some critical dates in history of modern day North America. For this we would need to go back little further in time. As far back as the beginning of 17th century, France had already explored the Mississippi River Valley and also established few settlements in the area. By the middle of the 18th century, France and major dominance over terrorists is United States. They are European power. Here say attended for New Orleans, the great lack of towards the northwest, the state of modern day of Montana. The New Orleans of today was established by explorer of Robert Cavalier and Sulier de Lacy in 1682 and was later Christian La Nouvelle Orleans in 1718 by Jean Baptiste Le Monde Valley. New Orleans was to grow and development around old square of the Denis Carries, which was basically a central square form of the French Quarter evolved. La Nouvelle Orleans was the capital of the French colony 1723 and grew into the vital hub of the trade and commerce. In 1762, France carried French Louisiana west to the Mississippi River to Spain after French and Indian War. Hence, in 1762, 18,000 La Nouvelle Orleans was under the Spanish rule. During these 4 decades, New Orleans was important trading and cultural Spanish output with friendly ties to Cuba, Haiti, and Mexico. The Spanish period of New Orleans history saw more liberal view on race and fostering social class of people known as the free people of color. We must also remember that America during these early years in 19th century still had a large population of the people of color working in the plantation in the southern state. In 8000, the Spanish state city Louisiana back to the France, but Napoleon Bonaparte in Empire of France was ready to see the city and Louisiana territory to the United States. As a result of Napoleon's eagerness to cede Louisiana to the United States, the United States of America was able to acquire nearly 8,28,000 square milli of land at very low cost, almost the rate of 3 cents per acre. The treaty between France and the United States was dropped April 13 and significant on May 2. In October 1803, the U.S. Senate ratified the purchase, and in December of the same year, France transferred authority over the religions of United States as a part of the $15 billion luminous purchase. Although French sold to Louisiana to United States, the inhabitants of New Orleans chosen to abandon their old ways, their culture and modes. If any, they helped trigger their Francophilia way, speaking mostly French and following French customs, cooking French cuisine, and propagating the opera and the complex social strategy of French resistance in now newly American city. The Corals, who was the American born offering the European shelters, many with French blood, were creating suffocating cosmopolitan society in colonial New Orleans. New Orleans, as many of already known as the birthplace of jazz, it emerged during last 19th century comparing to the general life. Rhythm, Blue and Spring Song. Will jazz grew prominent much later in 1920s with the Common of American Songbook, the most influential canon of American popular song and jazz standards in 1920 to 15 in America. Now, Orland had already been down the road in 18 yes. But from we had to read too far about New Orleans, the history, geography and culture of the city. What is crucial for the understanding is also who or what the corals were was large part of the culture in which Kate Chopin lived and wrote. Moreover, they figure prominently in the novel under the study. Edna Pontler and Kate Chopin. In this session, we shall examine the biographical association of life of Kate Chopin in connection with her novel, The Awakening first, and later look at the character of Edna Pontler as a mouthpiece of Kate Chopin. And this, Kate Chopin Edna Pound and Kate Chopin. In this section, we shall examine the biographic account of life of Kate Chopin in connection with her novel The Awakening first, and later look at the character of Edna Podler, the mouthpiece of Kate Chopin. Chopin also went regularly was Grand Isle summer vacation her family. Her life in a city and her resort on Grand Isle are replacing in the portrayal of Etna in the novel. The novelist's resort is Grand Isle is outside the norms. That exotic, unconventional space where during the husband's frequent absence, her relationship with Robert grows and her awakening take place. As a widow at 32, Chopin also did not follow the convention. In fact, the imagination of braved women in her right are those widows feeling joy at the newfound freedom and their desire and determination to pursue new and exciting interests. Her biography, Emily thought document that the young widow Kate Chopin had a passionate liaison with Albert Samfair, a married man. There are other such men in Pratt fiction, and they are all named allies. All kind desires and devoted themselves to sexual pleasure. As the novel, so too in real life, Chopin leave both her love and her life on the plantation to go and live with her mother and take care of her children. However, we need to remember that the novel only has some input from her life, and that it is not autobiography but a work of fiction. Edna Pondler in Kate Chopin's heroine, and they are certainly not the same person. Chopin came from the traditional southern family, her father being a religious Irishman. Although her education was gathered to reaching virtues of duty and submissive, her upbringing by her great grandmother, who was forward thinking, unconventional and independent, had much to do with kind of personality and taking Chopin's development. They delude in Chopin's life and in herself, making a conventional marriage follow in the expectation of society, when together with the phrase independence of spirit and the faulting of establishment norms like explore the city on her own, smoking in public, having an affair, not remarry. Etna to seek independence, express the dissatisfaction with her marriage. She wished above all to be an individual, not a mere more, such as wife of and a mother. In fact, she changed in notion that all mothers have maternal instinct. There is a useful description of Mrs. Pondler as a woman and a mother in this chapter. The writers comparing her another mother in the story. Adler Rottingone, Edna was not a mother woman, the child hardly rushing into her arms to be comfort if they had to fall during playoff. Instead, they would pull themselves together and get on. Mr. Ponley felt rather than perspective that his wife failed in her duty towards the children, a fact he was uh, regretful about. Mother, woman, and warm there were many grand Islay the summer and described as follow. In short, Mrs. Ponley was not a mother woman, and a mother woman seems to parvulate the summer of Grand Islay. It was easy to note them fluttering about with extended productive wings when their harm, real or imaginary, threatened their purposed broad. They were women who idolized their children, worshipped and their husband, and esteemed the holy privilege of offense themselves as individuals and grow wings as ministered angel. The awakening. L.A. Rattingole is one such delicious in the road, embodiment of every woman's grace and charm. Madame Rattingole has been married 7 years and her had a baby every 2 years and on her way to having another one and always taking about condition. She is busy anticipating future need of her children, fascination and swing things, while Mrs. Pondler does not see the usefulness for the point of that. Here, uneven the impulsive founded for her children is described in the text and is shown quite clearly that she is not ideally fit to the conventional role of the mother, hardly missing them when they are away in the fat of feeling, reveal the free. When she is happy, she stands them present, and later in the novel, when she is lived alone in the city, she goes to spend a week with them at that the grandmother in place liberally gives generosity and freely of herself, filling herself with their young existence. As they exceedingly shared with her their present lives in a countryside full pigs and cows and fish and tree. She leaves them with the pang. By the time she reached the city, the music of their leaves she carried back no longer echoes inside her and she is alone again. The writer components of Etna, a certain leaving has beginning to work dimly with her, the light which show the way forbidden it. This new sensation confused her, moving her dreams and thoughtfulness and tears for the first time in her life. She began to perceive herself possessed and universe as a human being who has relationship with the world around within her. The narrative comments on such a relation rationalization of that we like a weight of wisdom that all women might not have the privileges of receiving. So far, she has lived, and most women might do so for in their lives according to the rules and the conventional norms of society, and she is not disconnected with the situation. She began to feel the need to look at the self that goes beyond the role of wife and mother and realization confusing distribution and distinction of her. The imagery of sea display the violence of water. She hears the clarity murmuring to the university of the loose of beginning maze and contemplation and solitude. The voice of sea sparked her soul as it touched sensually enfold her body in soft, close embrace. Mrs. Podler has been displayed as a reserved and self-contained person, not get to the confidence, but here is a grand Isley. She began to lose some her reserve under the influence of beautiful, friendly, and frank Adair regularly. Enna recalled and shared with the friends and memories of her childhood days. When she walked in the green meadow, aimless and unthinking, just follow the impulse. She said too that it was similar state of the mind, ideal, uncertainty and ungate. that she felt here to be now. Here, uh, yearly of experience being passionately imparted by the dignified and sad eyes carving officer, somewhat attracted by another young gentleman who used to visit a lady to neighborhood plantation, and then finally as a lady going through the climax of emotion for the great tragedian as well known Shakespearean actor, not given later the describer narrator with meaning too, and even without realizing in Edna find her being talkative and sharing the events of her past while Adelaide, resting her head on friendly shoulder, the face turned to see. She felt flushing, intoxicated by the unfamiliar mood of her own which muddled her like wine or like a first breath of freedom. We are today about Etna marriage of Lonsi Pondler 2 in the chapter. Something that happening purely by accident without any romantic dreams on her part and more like to something that was decreed for her by the destiny. The narrator described the marriage and relationship as the following. He fell in love as manner in heavy doing. He pleased her and absolute devote faltered her. She fancied there was a sympathy of thought and tasted between them in which fantasy she was mistaken, and this violence option to her father and her sister Margaret to her marriage with Catholic. And we need to further for motive in her the accepted Monsieur Porter for the husband. All this shows in Edna is romantic. It had a part of her warning. A love in a world of beauty, unreality, romance, and dreams. Also, she rebel spirit and the object of her family. So the marriage convey her the excite what she was to do. She decided to become a devoted wife of man who worship her and thereby take her place with a certain dignity in the world of the reality. Closing the portrait for our began her upon reclaim romance and dreams. Let us sum up. The story of Kate Chopin Leaf can be divided into two neat sections. She belongs to an upper middle class Irish in French family, was married a young business with promising person. She became a mother of 6 children between the year 1871 to 1879. The second part of the life was devoted to writing as a scholar with about the clever division. Chopin here in 20s and 30s, married and bearing 6 children, half living a short life of the quiet, another through for 40s and 50s, writing, publishing, and involved in literacy society in depth of 1940. Victoria Bonnie, Kate Chopin, 19th century American women writers, a biography critical sources of Chopin writers in a diary in 22 May 1989, 1894 about the changes of came into her life after the death her husband in 1882 and her mother in 1885. If we are possible for a mother and husband to come back to earth, I said I would unhastingly give up everything that has come into life since they left. To do that, I would have to forget the past 10 years of growth, my real growth. However, here a real family like Louisiana, but custom consolidation career life of New Orleans and rural largely Kansas agriculture she was part of contribution a great deal to her later of the right. When she moved to the intellectual circle of St. Louis after her husband death, the life and society there encouraged her initiate literary talent update. According to the Chopin's brother-in-law, Patro Brazili, in which whom she played card in discussion religion. The inspiring plot of The Awakening came from the true story of New Orleans woman. In her own life, Chopin enjoyed being alone, independent, and having identity apart of her children. The novel Awakening is about sexual freedom and infinitely transformation of accepting code of behavior. Through this personality, Edna is about themselves get result of the discussion. In Kate Chopin or personal life, we find the same streak of independence, same belief in right of daily individual, and the very same determination choose happy on the way. circle critical response to the awakening. Introduction, critical history of awakening, summary of 19th century and other early response of mid center of critical response, not rebirth in 19th modern critical. The object of this unit are to briefly introduce you in a fact of around the publication represents history of awakening. This unit also seek to the familiarize you the critical history of awakening by providing brief comparison and symbol of early review published in the 19th century. When the novel first came, the brief summary of the reviving in the last year in after 1969, the year of publication of first autobiography of Free Sayad, which helping to give the novel new life meaning for the modern reader. The date of publication 1899 to Kate Chopin. The Awakening is a significant particularly dangerous in the last year of 19th century. It is also at the break of the unsharing of the 20. The above fact become even more important when we look at the closely and critical history of the novel. Critical history of the awakening. Condemned immediate on the publication and later discreetly ignored due to the discussion of taboo themes such as infinity, a woman's desire for self-definition, independence and sexual liberation, challenging in the institution of motherhood. It is more important of known as the awakening has received enormous attention in later years. It is obvious that a writer and the novel were much ahead of the time they were historically located in this. The awakening was considered completely transitory and unacceptable in the 19th century. In fact, the Emily John Chopin, most recent biographer, first reader, and a novel of 1970, she admitted to having been astonished that a woman in 1899 was asked the same question that we, in the newly received women movement, were asking 70 years later. Curly Aran, a French academic, discovered the novel wrote about in 1946. The translation into French in 1953 in Etna. All thought he thought Edna is a regressive and suicide unjustified. He claimed the 1899 works at the American made Warwick. Will Chart in 1890 had made the same comparison. In fact, several critical drew in a pillar at them. He also encouraged this young graduate student per settled to continue further research in this area, who in turn devoted long years of academic life in the project. Finally published both critical biography and computer work in 1969. The time of the novel rebirth was also crucial as it coincided with the second wave of the feminist movement. The relationship with Kate Chopin was now ready and the feminists climbed. The novel immediately as they saw the reflected in at all their important concerns such as women independence and liberty, self-definition and sexuality. It was repeated several times in 1970s and has inspired readers, scholars and critics continue to engage with their since. The awakening has made a long journey from being completely forgotten and ignored to become vastly popular. It is now also pronunciation that it is a part of several courses being through the students all over the world. Literary courses, course of feminist theory, women's writing, 19th century students, American students, textual linguistic folk, women's studies, etc. It is a part of course grade syllabus University of Delhi and now IGNOU are studied too. The next section briefly some 19th century critical response of text before in aspect. Summary of 19th century and other early critic response. Almost all critic of almost all critic of awakening through the Edna Poulter was a moral obsessive. Franz Porsche, who received the novel of St. Louis Mirror, was full of praises of the style and description, but termed Edna passion an ugly, cruel, loathsome monster. She continues, there is no fault to find with the telling of the story. There are no blemish in its art, but its leave one sick of the human nature and so on. Feel. Cubino, Daniel Radcliffe, Chopin's first biography, said complimentary things about her art, thoughts, the novel, exotic in setting, mobile in theme, erotic moment. Other critics too thought Edna was selfish and the novel was about moral psychology. In fact, most of the review praised the novel of skillful story and style, but almost all review saw the themes immoral and portrayal of Edna as a disagreeable, unfindable, vulgar, false art, declare of touch, and rare skill in construction. The sublet understand of motive, lack of high motive of the tragedy is not for young person. Some other comments are cities below and all the reviews from where they have been extracted are quite in full, so you will have all the publication details. The words of such stories is that they will fall into the hands of youth, leading them to dwell on things that only mature person can understand, and prominent unholden imagination and unclean desire. It was not necessary that would write of so great refinement and poetic grace of entire and overwork filled sexual fiction. The story was not worth telling and tell disagreeable gamblings of sensuality and repellment. It is not a healthy book. The position of the passion seems to have a entire her system, her mother's milk. These command to do clearly the details of reviewer as a detailed form a part of reading last at the end of the block. C.L. Doyo published in San Luis Post Dispatch 20 May 1899 writers about Kate Chopin's craftsmanship as a novelist. There may be many opinions touching other aspects of Mr. Chopin's novel, The Awakening, but all must concede is false art. The delicacy of touch art skills is construction, the suitable understanding of motive, the search vision into the receive of the heart. These are not to the reader of Bifolk and A Night in Academy. But in this new work power appears power born confidence. There is no uncertainty in the line. So sure the female drawn complete mastery is appeared on every page. 19th century response, contemporary reviews, C.L. Donny, St. Lucie Post Dispatch, 2019 repair, Mangry called The Awakening, New York, the North. The little further effort of commitment of plot and the use of language is awakening. Nothing want to make a complete artistic wall in delicious English, quick with life. Never words too much, simple and pure and story process with the classic surveyed through the lady writ of doubt, the temporary and dawn despair. I thought a lot of writers in excess Kate Chopin is work. Mostly her short stories are the subject of discussion. The awakening disappeared completely for the literary scene during the first half of the 20th century. Joseph Riley suggested that dozen stories selected from Chopin two collections of stories. Fiction world, a creative single work which these most proud and American literature would gladly proclaim an addition masterpiece. However, the novel is mentioned by him, and he does not even seem aware of it. In fact, the manners of absolute disappearance of the literary scenes during this time give a push on the theory that is based on take off in the library cell. But this was a rumor that than the reality of Emily thought established through her research and interview, etc. It was also rumored that Chopin, also heartbroken by the reception of the novel, she stopped the writing together. This too has been disproved, as she did not write the published more story fiction, but all her work followed. The Awakening was more conventional, less significant. Last was the publisher rejected a vacation and voiced although reason are offer in any of her paper there is controversial concurrence. Daniel Radcliffe assumed that it had a connection with the negative reception of the novel, where his later biography believed it has a business decision on the part of the publishers that was unrelated to Chopin's early work. Middle century critical responsibility under the novel Rebirth in 1969. In 1950, however, scenario changed something at American critics began to recognize the awakening was important literary work. Van Wickenbrook called the novel one novel of the 19th South that should have been remembered small, perfect book in matter that the life of work of many prolific writers. In 1956, Kenneth Hebben called the first rate novel one that deserved to be retold the given the place among novel worth presentation. He praised it generally exists. The author, he said also, quite frankly, the book is about sex. It is commercial was not disappearing as in the case of other critics of before them. The mid-century then saw the any American critics engage positively with the awakening calling Chopin's text. The anarchotomy lonely existentially voice out of the mid 20th century. They discover the novel satire of American past is both a happening and occasion of their same shame. Not many readers would claim to know all the American literature, but some of us to think that at least we know the best of it. The awakening has have been too much and too long neglected. And finally came individual work of discovery by Perseid the complete, the relevance of the novel from the necessary of obligation, placing it clearly on the literacy and feminist map. The novel is a modern novel as it probably with the still patriarchal tomorrow. Modern critical interpretation. It will try to sum up important 1970 response to the novel so you get a fair idea about how the critical insight the changes and the development as a new literary theories began to the shape thinking. Although critics English begin to see the awakening as a crucial literary statement about women question to emancipation of traditional and stereotypical gender role leading to her determination to live life on her own terms. There was a emphasis that it was extremely political work, word and the woman was considered from women's rights. That she was really a writer who held the moderate position and did not interest the work of feminist document. Some she had a trapped system to which she offered the best some personal revelation and resistance. Lawrence previous the test to be very politic as Edna is divided by her private vision and the society she discovered during the summer on Grand Isle. Speak also the ladyard of the social conventional marriage and motherhood that closing around her like a vice. Land has believed Edna lives in a new woman in an old society with its convincing prejudice and supervision. Too small thought to be able to change anything. In 1976, Emily Tonsworth Edna was emphasized 19th century feminist criticism to other feminist critics had to see her as nothing able to beyond self-questionnaire, a large engagement with social circuit operation. Critics has recovering Edna articulation of important issues like childhood and motherhood and providing to disaster, causing intensity, death, and for more significant shoppings of a mother losing of self. Several critics have view on the novel is very modern as it does not provide of any final answers. It is ambiguous and mysterious. It taken to many sides of perspective and withholding judgment are seen being real statements as this implicates of it is probing of such normal question as the nature of sexuality, selfhood and freedom, other meaning of adultery and suicide. The relationship between biological dynasty and personal choice. Elizabeth Flock Garvey in an article, The Awakening is a contest of experience, culture and value of Southern women. Approach to the teaching, Chopin Awakening edit with Bernard Coxey. The Awakening shocking Chopin, contemporary of the same reason that it has earned the administrative recent generation is scantly acknowledgement women's impulse. Modern readers tend to be Edna Awakening to her sexuality as a logically potential, her struggling of liberation. Yet Chopin remains more ambiguous, thus investing multiple, even confirmatory reading. Interpreting the awakening. The final section of the unit summarizes few important ways to reading and interpreting the novel, offered by critics during the late 90s. In some of the more recent instance, Donald Price in this a note on Kate Chopin's The Awakening is a natural fiction Southern Literary Journal. Praise reader novel was examined natural fiction, which he described the principal innovation movement in American fiction of 1890s. He defined literary natures and dramatization of limitation placed upon the human well-being, biological and social realities with which we will attain the finding the way. He uses Darwinian theories in his essay focusing upon Edna Indeble's overcome the biological intention of motherhood despite her repeated rejections of the socially imposed expansion of the role. This essay is particularly relevant as it compares one more Gastavate Fabulous, Emma Bonseri and Kate Chopin, The Awakening, Head Trace. Emma is a journey towards the become Edna, the marriage woman who move on more the suicide after the wearing in marriage and knowledge of an although adulterous passion. He noticed too, however, the suffocations of Chopin. The later writer were read in the work of uh, Charles Darwin, Adolf Huxley, and Herbert Spencer, and thus familiar with the intellectual thought at that time. Analyze the unconventional behavior of both heroines. Emma Bovey, Edwin Pollard is pathological. He comments on the presence of Dr. Marlett, who suggested she needs an inspired psychologist, thus in anticipated of theory of thought, whose work was just emerged in this time. In Emma Bovey's world, there is no understanding in the Edna in Galmary. Her doctor at last shows some comprehension, even it ultimately held in the convention of what Freud himself will continue to call the riddle of woman. Stephen Hell point out the following the theme of lesbianism, hint it through the partial medievalism rise, the significant sword telling, and the both novel predominantly imagine of birds and modify the fight. Emma wishes to escape the life by fly away the embarrass. Melly recites speak the Etna of the bird that would soar above the level plane to the traditional and the projection. He draw the attention of the parrot. He speaks the language which nobody understood, suggesting the problem of representation of chopping face. The novel ends with the voice of a sea, one which Edna was responding throughout, and now awakening attitude identify with. He located both novels in the tradition of woman modernism. See the later as a continuous of the modernist project between two, parrot and sea. There is a whole process of substance of Chopin's writing. The difficult cause of Edna desire for herself reach out the ultimate. Levi Swancher is the material discourse the Roman of self position of Kate Chopin's The Awakening boundaries too. Review. The novel is a tradition of American literature began out a search for self, the theme of conflict between individual and social, but primary has begun male concern. Mainstreaming American text was, however, thrown the scattered letter. In the case of novel, these themes are further problematized by the fact of maternity and motherhood. She writes the novel raises many general questions about the difference in Roman writing by women. And more especially, it raises the question of whatever woman may be hero of the romance. So, Spencer use a feminist theory, examine the complex presentations of motherhood, responsibility of role of mother, metaphor of self-birth, and seductive material. See with the liberal Edna. She praised Edna's early awakening as a universal and not merciful gender specific, and yet she also sees motherhood individual mutual excessive. Edna model of individual or male are part of Millie Resist, who is also represented as somewhere strange. However, although she highlighted the idea of male subjectivity of Edna follows a pattern of male hero romance, defines herself as self through the desire of another, she questioned it too by the last image being one where Edna is a straightly remains of her womanhood, motherhood, while attending the Adelaide during the childbirth. Thus her fight towards the freedom in seeking somewhere kind of the ideal relationship she realized has to take in account to those antagonists the children. The unable to reconcile two conflict but equal powerful aspect of herself, she make the only chosen available here at time. Many readers who read the novel today may assert the choices of women Edna's situation have not increased remarkably in the century that have gone by. Since the time of the publication of novel 1899, that is post is was making the awakening important today, modern, relevant, contemporary, and thus constantly under the discussion of readers, students, and researchers. Contemporary criticism is continuous engage with new approaches to reader, the awakening, perspective information by movement of literary theories such as feminism, post-structuralism, new historicism, psychoanalysis, deconstruction, and recent development in field history, economic, philosophy, sociology, etc. Let us sum up. This unit had tried to look at the late 19th century novel, the awakening from the point of view of the kind of critical comments of response that is generated particularly at the time when novel was published. For whatever has been discussed so far, we do dissent the novel was not really welcomed or even liked at the time of the publication. But we also come to realize through the course of this unit that the novel The Awakening was rediscovered and reborn in 1970s, and the feminist intensity claimed addressing issues of importance of them. Since the novel has been circulations is even thought and in fact cannot say all this to may mind in the novelist potential appeal to even modern day reader. Critical approach to the awakening feminist psychological others. Critical approach may define very simple. David Ashley does in the introduction to the second edition. Critical approaches the literature as very illustration both nature of literature in the nature of criticism as an important way in which literature. In our case of novel, Awakening can be disclosed. Keeping this in mind, let us begin by looking very briefly at the novel and the process of examining the feminine approach, the awakening and the age. The novel, as you already know, written by published towards the end of the 19th century. In 1899, to be the precise, it was literally end of the 19th century. And the 19th century, as we are all aware, with the Victorian age in England, approximately a period of 6 years for the 1830s to the 1890s, an age defined by moral stance of extreme difference conveys it was an age when the man could not smoke in public. Today, smoke is a ban by most countries, include our own country, due to health reasons. But during the Victorian age, it was thought to indecorous or a woman ride a bicycle. But it was also the age of relative peace of in England, while America was faced with the spread of civil war. Case of civil, but it also the peace of England, West America was faced with the scare of civil war. 1861-65. But at the same time, there was also interaction between America and European writers, and it was age of what Edward Albert called spacious intellectual horizon, noble endeavors, and bright aspiration. The novel was having in the earlier unit was controversial on as it dealt with issues then thought is to be taboo and did not receive is due to them. It was a discourse nearly 60 years later. The prominently claimed the feminists, given the theme of novel is absolute lead in the serious critical events as we may have described from the earlier unit. In the next session, we will look at the feminist approach to literature if some deals at the way of extreme issues and dealt with the novel. Feminist approach to awakening. Let us begin the session of what Andhra Pradesh has to say. A significant area supposed to identify the contemporary novel related to women in all society representing race or class. Most of the novel in the 20th century present women with base, scarcely any light and shield on the question of women's exploitation under the pressure of home, marriage and the overarching patriarchy. Such feeling was created feminist approach to literature that became a major concern form in the late 1970s when feminist theories came to be believed to linguistic and literary material. Much of feminist critical theory is derived from the work of French feminine writer Simone Beauvoir in the particular. Her book of Second Sex or Late Deluxe Sex publication in 1949. Beauvoir's main content was when women was associated with humanity. The women were very often related to the lesser space, a lower, a inferior position in society. Critics after behavior strengthened the debate by the focusing on language as tool of male dominance with looking at the manner in which the main point of view was therefore presenting as the point of view. Then there was a critic who felt the women not only had different experience from men but also write differently. Critics such as Henry Chalks tried to look at the essential connection between woman body, though sexually pleasure, what being to represent, and women's writing. Martin Ray, the Bedford Glossary of Critical, the Literary Terms. This is, by the way, is justice begun of the discussion on the feminist critical approach to the literature. The Awakening. You could read up more feminist theory and feminist critical approach if you would like to learn more about this approach. Coming back to novel The Awakening, let us look at the feminist issues this week through the character of Edna Pondler. Some of the issues that are coming to mind are the notions of women being viewed as personal prosperity by the men in the novel. For instance, if we look at the time, period, and culture in which of the novel has been set, there are innumerable indents that indicate the fact the men simply thought over wives' personal property. It almost appears as if they do not know the better or could not even convey the fact. Their wives were independent people with mind of their own, as in the case with Edna Podler. This may also be discounted when we look critically at the what Edna Podler has to say about wife Edna Podler as well as the interior voice. The woman in question, in this case, Edna is a God helping with the she is awakened and feels sensitive, hopeless, and endeavored in her marriage as well as within the wall of the domesticity. An awakening of Edna was course has distinguished continues the unlimited result her suicide has it towards the end of the novel. The awakening is also very good illustration of how the society to enforce the norms of conveying by isolating anybody who decide differently in the norms in particular. So women's daring to do so. More of the novel describes very clearly how society imposed the norms. Some women, such as Adler religious, who find the both economic as well as social reward conform, whereas Edna Pondler does not do so, and society finds is non-conformity and sign of rebellion and does not look upon these as act of transgression in the sympathy. In fact, society punished the so-called rebel. Others isolated, fearing that such flawed character made challenging society very existence. Edna Pondler, after her awakening, in this case of first awakening, which we may be looking upon sexual awakening, we see things herself as a woman with a desire. Is a changing woman for her aesthetic as well as sexual desires are important, whereas traditions and conveying are seen in the those imposed therefore trust upon women are not desirable. The against are instant where Leona Potler thinking his wife's aspiration are mercy trivial and furious that he can actually make her conform his way of life, which is a sense of very difficult thinking of Edna Polo to accept. She finds the world excessive pain and frustration. The awakening session awakening, this is a stage. Edna also emerged as a character who seeks to take a control of her life on life and her own feeling as someone who wishes to escape from the conveys of marriage, domesticity, and even motherhood more than placing or satisfy husband, home, and hearth. Moreover, Edna finds her struggling with the feeling of motherhood, the lacking of it, as she also realized when society dictates motherhood as being a mother. These instances that we are talking about some point indicate of the manner in which feminists could approach the study of text. In the next section, we shall look at the psychoanalytical approach to literature about the we shall try the suggestion point to examine the non-under with the approaches of mind. Psychoanalytical approach to the awakening. The psychoanalytic approach to the literature derived from the work of Australian Sigmund Freud is 1850 to 1939. The psychoanalyst of professional, he was pioneer of the psychoanalytic criticism. He developed a language that described a model of explain, a theory that accompanies human psychology, all direct or indirect related to the nature of the unconscious mind. Freud identified three components of human psyche: the id, the ego, and superego. The id, according to first, is a predominant, passionate, irrational, unknown, and unconscious part of the psyche. The ego, which is prominent, rational, logic, orderly, and cautious. The ego is also mediated between the id and superego. The superego, according to Freud, is the part of the human psycho and interlinked norms and modes of society. Immediately, that reflection of a social norms more may looking at the external and outside of the self, and self-checking in building mechanism that make moral judgment and tell us to make sacrifice even if we know that such sacrifice may not be in our best interest. Sigmund Freud also believed that human beings, we all have what he calls repressed wishes and fear that have been pushed under the carpet on the surface by the superego, that is capacity as a moral guardian, and that which has been pushed even further by ego in the unconscious realism of the human psyche, the representation of manifestation in the form of dream, in the language as a feudalization sleep and creative activity, then Freud says, may produce art including literacy and neurotic behavior. Freud also talking about Oedipus complex and used analysis of drama as a tool of uncovering or unrepresenting feeling and memories. Freud was opinion that expression surface in dream, masking in symbolic form. Carl Gustav Jung and other psychologists developed the theory of the collective unconscious and repository of the shared unconscious memories date back to the origin of literature. According to Jungian theory, the great work of literature is not a distinguished expression of his other representing wish, all thought by far by manifestation of desire, once he held to whole human race, but that are only represent become advanced civilization. The French theorist Jacques Land focused more on language and language related issues. He extended Freud theory of dream, literature, and their interpretation. He also added to elements of language of Freud, emphasis on psyche and gender. For Lacan, unconscious in language are dreams from the discourses. Thus, we may study the dream of psychologically in order to learn more about the unconscious. Lacan identified three stages of development: pre-oedipal stage, and pre-verbal stage, and mirror stage or imaginary stage, and third, I stage, stage of flow, language, and society. Symbolism of the awakening. The reason why I had to choose and talk about the psycho Symbolism in the awakening. The reason why I have chosen to talk about psychoanalytical approach is the essential to draw your attention to symbol and symbolism in the novel The Awakening. Symbol stated for suggestion, something else, something large, something more complex, often an idea or a range of interrelated ideas. Symbols stand for suggestion something else, something large, something more complex, often ideas or range of inner relation ideas, attitude and practice. The word symbolic as a state in Unit 2, Session 1.5 connected the Greek word symbolize to means throw together. Keeping in the mind what has been to said about symbol and symbolism, there we shall now proceed to look at the sum of the symbols in their significance in the awakening. Simply put, symbols may be recognized as object, character, figure, or colors used to represent abstract idea, concept. There are several symbols that come to mind when I think the awakening. You may have to notice these are well, but may or may not have recognized them or looking at the same symbol, or you may have to already recognize that the symbol and gone ahead analyzing them as a well. In the case that is been to taking about symbol of a bird in the novel, bird stands for something in the novel. The bird have been described discussing and any bird imaginary and draw up the represent imagine of interpretation in the awakening. The cages bird signify Edna Polar's own entrepreneur within the conflict of their marriage and children. It could also be identified with the conflict of the entrapment of all women or women are generally in the Victorian age as we do. How now the position of women. The Madden Lubrin parrot and the mockingbirds could be looking up at the significant Edna Polar and Madame Rizet as well. Since both of the birds are capital, their movements and restriction. Similarly, the movement of the women in the novel are restricting and limitation of the conveying and traditional layout down the society, and particularly a rigid one as that they are so several restricted in the movement that at the time they fail even communicate with the world around them. For instance, Edna Polar is not able to articulate their innermost anger clear even their husband or to herself for the matter, or many other characters in the novel. She tried to escape from the narrow convey of the society, the democracy of the marriage and her children. She set up the place extremely for her away from the husband and her children. The pigeon house, the fine solid the fate of new home in the symbolic. Her independence, but the reader where away the pigeon house is a fact. Just two steps away, the real indication of her own intensity, inability to remove herself in there of her form life. Her friend Mademoiselle Research tell Edna Polar that she will need to have a very strong wing order to survive the tutorial that she will face. She intends to the act on her love to Robert Luberon. But the time she set up the pigeon house, we know that he has gone away from Mexico. Matt Mollis raised warm to Edna Polar, saying, the birds, the wood soar above the level of pain of tradition and prejudice must have strong wings. It is a spectacle to see the weakening, bursting, exhausted, faltering back the earth. Then there is a critical of the novel who also used final imaginary of the bird to argue that Edna Polar's suicide at the end of the novel is fact and a sign of defeat, both for her individual as well as for all women general. A bird within broken wings and beat air the above, reeling, faltering, creeling, disappearing down onto the water. While these critics quite in from such a text on an emphasis Edna and a women default general, some other critics argue that the symbol of the bird is significant Edna Paul individually default, but that is conquered defeat of women in the Victorian age. The Edna Paul suicide final awakening may also looking up the representing the fall tradition convey that sense may be decided have been achieved the Edna Paul suicide. We have already taken about symbolism of sea in unit 2, but we can always take a round look at the sea in the major symbolism of the novel. Here is a well, the sea has been used the symbolism of many authors and covers. We must not forget imagine of the sea on myths as well as imagine in the Bible. In particular, I am talking about two major works for must have to read or not. You must identify here about Herman Melville, Moby Dick, and Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, right in Cuba in 1951, published 1950. Both these novels, actually, the latter is novella or or a short novel, a long short story, just under the 100 page. The symbolism and the sea also figure in the novel is a big way. The sea may be said to be the significant center of space, boundless, timeless, sense of freedom from the life, shore and hence for life's trail and the temptation as well. And the interesting is not Edna Pola has tried to learning, seeming unsatisfied early, but she is a thoughtful Robert Labyrinth, learned to swim and feel the sea and the surface buckling as the towards the novel. She is said to the seduced by the sound of the surface. The reports of surface, seductive, never chasing, whispering, calmarious, murmuring, investing to soul of water for spelling in abyss of solid. To lose its amazing inward contemplation, and she succeeds to the temptation on when she has actually been empowered by the acting learning scene successfully. She is also aware of her by extension human being place in a scheme of things is obvious from the next quite of same chapter. In short, Mr. Potler was beginning to realize her position in universe as a human being and recognize her relation as an individual in the world within the about her. Through the novel, there is a sense of unknown, the wild sea and the surface called out to her. Moreover, if we look at the sea, not a sea per sea but the water, then we get another picture of the symbolism of the sea, the awakening. If we look at the sea as a water, then we would realize the sea then symbolizes ritual cleansing, the Christian concept baptism, rebirth, and it is therefore at the Edna Podler should drown the sin away or the death of symbolism, her rebirth or rebirth of the soul. The awakening is a very rich symbolism as I mentioned earlier, and it is now up to you to take an initiative and look at the symbolism in the novel. We have mercifully pointed out what the symbolism is and how to example to how to symbolism work. We accept you look at the symbols in novel you as you read it. However, we had still like a point few more symbolism to you in your ask, but we accept you explore the symbolism behind this. For instance, look at the way of Edna Pondler. The women in novel are presented to us, the reader in the novel. The mother woman seems to prevalent the summer a grand lifestyle. It was easy to know them fluttering about the extended wing, the any arm really to imaginary, threatened their precious brooms, and they were women who idolized the children, worship their husband, and esteem it is a holy privilege of FS themselves as individual and grow wings in a mystery angel. We look at the treatment of Kate Shop in The Awakening as it seemed to the awakening Edna Pondler. Take a case of the bird imaginary in the novel. Birds are close or other symbols you can locate it else. Then there is the wall symbolism gathering, food, meal symbolism of the house. Edna Pontler is a desert, the land swimming, the symbol of moon, finally the ocean, the Gulf of Sea, the dusk could also including music on the play of the piano and sleep the symbols. In this unit, we are trying to look at several critical approaches of literature and the particular of novel in case the awakening. We have also designed three major approaches of summarize these approach very briefly, while the point out the instance of the novel indicate how could analyze or approach novel from the perspective of these approaches. In particular, we have dealt with the symbolic approach to the study. The awakening is a great deal.